Thomas, this is the Global Digest think tank group.
But my expertise is in the military use of the electromagnetic spectrum. So electronic warfare is my thing. I'm not an expert on things like air power, land warfare, that kind of thing. I can talk generally about them.
Why don't you explain more detail about those, electronic warfare issue radar decades ago, 2 decades ago, and current? Is there a lot of changes?
In terms of the military use of the electromagnetic spectrum, I mean, just to sort of back up a bit for your audience, to clarify a few things. I mean, firstly, we all use the electromagnetic spectrum, and in fact, we use it without even realizing it, because we use it every day for our smartphones, to listen to the radio, to watch television broadcasts, for navigation, all kinds of things. Our world would be very different if we didn't have access to it, and particularly we use the radio part of that spectrum. So the electromagnetic spectrum is a huge thing, and it encompasses things like visible light, ionizing radiation, things like X-rays, for instance. It encompasses radio waves, which is primarily what I'm concerned with and one of the things I'm interested in. And as I mentioned, we use radio for all kinds of things, and it's no surprise then that the military are highly reliant on it as well. And the military primarily use radio waves in the radio spectrum, first of all for radar, so that's to detect where targets are, measure what those targets are doing, how fast they might be flying, how high they might be flying, which direction they're going in, that kind of thing, to guide weapons, for instance. And they also use the radio spectrum for communications, radio communications, much like we do with our smartphones, for instance, and also for navigation. So when we're using GNSS, Global Navigation Satellite Systems, or what's colloquially known now as GPS, the generic for the American system, Global Positioning System. When we're using it to navigate our way around a city or to find our Airbnb or something, the military are also using it to help themselves navigate or to get weapons onto targets. So everybody relies on this resource, and because everybody relies on it, it is a highly contested resource, which means that in war now, there's as much an impetus on either belligerent to dominate the electromagnetic spectrum, and the radio spectrum in particular. What I mean by that is to prevent your adversary being able to use it as much as they want or in the way they want. As it is important for militaries to dominate the air, land, sea, space, and of course cyberspace domains now. So it's a very important thing, and there's a growing awareness, I think, outside the military in terms of the security impact that the radio spectrum has. So the military have long been aware of this, and they've long used the spectrum. But I think beyond it, we're now seeing political communities, societies at large, realizing that they really, really do need to protect their access to the radio spectrum if they're going to enjoy their way of life in the way that we do at the moment. And that it creates an inherent sort of political dimension to things as well. So there's a growing awareness of the importance of the radio spectrum and its centrality, not just to conflict, but to our everyday lives. So that's sort of how I would characterize things at the moment.
So can you say those military electronic warfare, radar and communication are not for private, or it's private usable right now? I think usually military, they very much secret, a very advanced tool they did not allow private to use. Is there anything restriction?
Well, in terms of how we use the spectrum, I mean, typically what happens is that, first of all, the radio spectrum is a finite resource. So it's not limitless. It's like a road network or a rail network or something. There is only so many users that can host it in a particular area at any one time. So generally speaking, what governments try and do is they try and divide the spectrum up domestically into such a way that everybody can use it in a safe and responsible fashion. So typically in any country, you'll have a regulator that will stipulate, for instance, that radio and television broadcasting can use certain frequencies, civilian cell phone users, who are probably the biggest users now of the radio spectrum, can use other frequencies. The frequencies that you would use for your remote control of your car, for instance, to unlock the doors, that's governed on a particular frequency. And then within that, the militaries have their own frequencies that they can use domestically. So for things like radar, for instance, for radio communications, that kind of thing. Now that's at the domestic level. What happens at the global level is that the United Nations, through the International Telecommunications Union, which is the global regulator of the radio spectrum, they govern who can use which parts of the spectrum where. So, for instance, if you've got a ship that is moving from one port to another, it's going through international waters, it will have certain frequencies it is allowed to use for marine radio communications, certain frequencies it's allowed to use for radar, that kind of thing. When it goes into a domestic port, those frequencies may be different. It may have to change frequencies in order to correspond with the local port authorities, for example, because the local radio regulator, domestic radio regulator, may have stipulated that other frequencies are necessary to be used. So there's a process of management. So in terms of how the military use it, the military is subject really to the same rules as everybody else, which is domestic rules and international rules. Now, sometimes that can differ, because if a country's at war, that regulator may not exist anymore, or there may be different organizations who are then governing the regulator. So then it's up for the military to try and navigate how they do that. Because remember, they're as much at risk from people interfering in their radio use as we might be from them interfering in us. So it's a double-edged sword. So everybody has to sort of, it's a bit like deciding which side of the road you drive on. You know, governments stipulate that we either drive on the right or we drive on the left, and they do it for very good reason, because it would just be chaos if they didn't. And it's a similar thing with the spectrum. So that's sort of how the military worlds and the civilian worlds really share this resource.
I see. So you are from inside military, or you are not?
No, I'm not in the military. No. My interest is academic, and from an analytical point of view. So that's where I come from to study this subject. I have an academic hat that I wear. I'm very honoured to be an associate fellow of the Royal United Services Institute in London. But then, in terms of my day-to-day job, as well as helping to represent them on matters of security and military use of the radio spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum, I also write on these subjects for a range of publications and provide consultancy on those subjects, and also talk to media organizations as well.
So probably you know very well about French military and overall European military, their capacity and skill about electronic. How's your French position or Europe position if enemy anytime invade, or if any conflict occur? I mean, now you have already in Ukraine. So how's your capacity position compared to other side?
As you made a very good point there, John. Yeah, indeed, Europe is sadly at war once again, as Ukraine has shown, and we're also facing conflict on our eastern flank down in Israel, with obviously what's happening there, the situation in Gaza. In terms of the military preparedness in Europe, if you take Europe's NATO membership at the moment, generally speaking, there is a recognition and there's a growing awareness that Russia is a hostile actor that is threatening European interests. And I think because of that, there is a willingness to strengthen and improve the military posture across the continent. And we're seeing that with deployments, for instance, of NATO troops up in the Baltic, up in the high north of Europe, and also strengthening of military spending. NATO, for instance, has a guideline that all of its members must spend a minimum of 2% of their gross domestic product on defense each year. Now, in principle, most countries don't spend that. They may spend close to it, but they don't spend that. And a handful, including the United States, including Greece, for instance, the UK and now France, either maintain that 2% figure or they spend more than that. What you're going to be seeing over the next year is most countries meeting that 2% target. NATO's European membership at the moment, according to NATO's own figures from last year, spends on average 1.9% of its GDP. So it's getting there. You know, the direction of travel is the correct one. But I think that there is a willingness and a recognition that Europe's combat strength and its military strength must improve. And I think that is happening. I think the risks to that are twofold. I mean, that the first risk is probably the possibility of the re-election of Donald Trump in November. And if that occurs, the future of NATO regrettably does come into question if Mr. Trump makes good on his promises to downsize or even remove the US commitment to the alliance altogether. And the other challenge is, I think, a bit more of an isolationist political mindset that you're having in some countries across Europe, well, most countries, regrettably. I mean, the UK perhaps best illustrated that with the Brexit referendum in 2016, a wish to become more insular, a wish to not work with their European allies as they've done in the past. I'm seeing it in my own country that there is a political attraction to having a more isolationist mindset, to not getting involved in foreign wars or not supporting Ukraine, for instance, and that's happening along the political extremes. And it's happening elsewhere. But I think that being said, if you extrapolate the political situation, and for instance, you look at the death of Alexander Navalny the other week in Russia, I think that did jolt a lot of people into thinking, well, Russia is a hostile neighbor, it's a belligerent neighbor, it's threatening European security and it's threatening the political cohesiveness of European nations. And therefore, there must be a riposte of some sort and there must be a deterrence value. And I think that is one of the things also now that is spurring a rejuvenation, if you like, of European military strength.
Right. I mean, the geopolitically and political issue is right. You said Europe has special consideration from all sides, NATO, Europe, and neighboring regions. But what about the technology, military capacity, electronic warfare, radio, military communication, all these things? How's your capacity? You can defend enough or you can produce enough to prevent any, attack deeply inside Europe. You still rely on NATO. NATO means a lot of America technology. What about your own indigenous capacity products?
I think I'm consistently impressed at the European level in terms of the quality of technology that European defence suppliers are able to produce, and equally the research and development base that Europe has got to help realise that. The challenge always, I think, is twofold. I mean, the first challenge is squaring the desires of the military with the money that is available, and there is only ever a finite amount of money that can be spent on defence. We all understand that. Obviously, that has to be balanced with other government spending commitments. But I think, generally speaking, the quality of European defence equipment, particularly in the electromagnetic sphere, is very, very good, and I think it's improving. I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine was quite instructive because I think for many of us in the analytical community, me included, we were surprised by how badly some Russian systems worked. And equally, we were alarmed by how much better other systems were, which perhaps we didn't think they would do. I think one of the things it's underscored and what the European militaries realize, and I know the Americans certainly realize this, is that if there is a confrontation with Russia, I mean, the most important thing will be to dominate the electromagnetic space and to prevent Russian forces being able to use that to their advantage. And that will be as important as ensuring that there is NATO/European air superiority over any European theatre of operations. I mean, the two of the big lessons learned from Ukraine is that you need to absolutely own the airspace and you need to absolutely own the spectrum. And if you can do those two things, your ability then, particularly in the ground and the naval environment, to get moving and to be able to not only attrit forces, hostile forces, but to be able to maneuver advantageously against them becomes very important. I wouldn't advocate for one moment that electronic warfare or maneuvering in the electromagnetic spaces is any more important than ground operations or naval operations or air and space operations. They are all important and they all have a vitally important role to play. But I would say that if you do not own the spectrum and if you do not have freedom of maneuvering within that, I think you tend to find, as the Ukrainians and the Russians are doing, that operations can become a lot more difficult. And going back to your original question, I think that is where the acumen of European military electromagnetic research and development comes in. It's the ability to recognize that, and then it's on top of that, the ability to realize the military capability that is needed to achieve that goal.
I see. Probably, I guess, French is the only or the main sources of electronics for military defense weapon supply in Europe. Which else, apart from France, they are producing or supplying electronic warfare, military facility, mainly France, isn't it?
Europe's got a very vibrant defense industry. So France is one of the big suppliers of electronic warfare systems and electromagnetically dependent systems like radars and radios, for instance, but it's by no means the only country doing it. Germany has a very vibrant industry in this area. Sweden, Italy, Spain, United Kingdom, Norway, for instance. I think most countries in some shape or form are involved in this sector in Europe. And the question is to what extent are they involved? But the reason they tend to be is a historical one, which is tended to be that European nations have liked to be self-sufficient in defense equipment. That has mainly changed over the years because the sheer costs involved of, for instance, trying to build your own, design and build your own sixth generation fighter aircraft are now prohibitive for a single nation to do it on their own. But the thing in the electromagnetic space that was a big driver was that, generally speaking, it has been a domain that's been characterized by a significant amount of secrecy. And because of that, countries have tended to want to operate very unilaterally within that space, not necessarily become as collaborative as they have been in other areas. That is starting to change now, slowly, but it is starting to change. And I think that's part of the reason why you do still have a lot of national champions in the electronic warfare world, the electromagnetic world. Beyond Europe, what you're seeing is also that the United States obviously is very, very big in this area, as are the Israelis. And then we're also seeing new players come in terms of actors in Korea, also in the Middle East. Singapore, for instance, and then we have the big traditional suppliers like Russia and China as well. So it's a very vibrant sector at the moment.
Right, because even though Europe is the biggest power in terms of monetary, European Union is powerful, but if France want to produce, you have to rely on France finance, France budget. You cannot ask other European countries to provide financing or funding for producing equipment. It may be difficult to collaborate for funding, right? Each country decision to finance and to produce. But many countries in Europe, they are not a very big military supply or manufacturing. France is doing, but collective funding may be difficult, right? In terms of space, you cannot make any defense or military project, not much, only education or scientific purpose because of budget and many things issue, So, you have European Union for projecting together is not easy. That's the same problem.
I think to an extent, but I think to be fair to the EU, through initiatives like the European Defence Agency, I think that's starting to change because there's a recognition that you do need a European level of collaboration on big defence projects, and you're seeing it in the electromagnetic space as well. The European Defence Agency has a number of work strands which are going on in terms of developing systems and capabilities that all European nations can use. And the EDA is a very important organization to do that because effectively it acts as a collaborative space where nations can come together. They can put some money on the table, however that much may be, and then they can get also work share on the behalf of their local industries. And on top of that, they then get the product when it's developed. So I'll give you an example. There's a European Defence Agency project, or it's actually through OCCAR, which is a NATO and sort of co-NATO European defence development and procurement agency. And that is developing a system called ESSOR, which is the European Secure Software Defined Radio Waveform. It's not the world's most kind of fun sounding product maybe, but what it is a very important thing because it's working to have a common radio system or radio software that all of the users can put in their radios, and they can use that to be able to talk to another allied nation who may be on the same operation. So we do it all the time with our cell phones. We're very used to it. You know, if I called you now, we would our call would come from southern France, and it would go to you, and it would go through it would be handled through a number of different cell phone companies. It would go across different radio systems, and eventually we'd have our conversation. Believe it or not, that's very hard to do in the military. It's very difficult to have country A speak to country B using the same radio system. So the ESSOR project is a way to try and overcome that. And that has been done in a kind of approach, a collaborative approach with several European nations. And again, each country brings some money to the table, and they get some work share, and they get the finished product. And I think that approach is really trying to do exactly what you were talking about with your question, which was there is a finite amount of money. How do we all ensure that money is spent as sensibly as possible and we all reap the benefits from it? And I think now at the European level, really with major defense projects, the collaborative mindset is the only way forward, really, because at the macro level, you know, our populations are getting older, so everybody's healthcare costs goes up. The business of running a state never becomes cheaper. It is only ever going to get more expensive. So you have to think of where can you make the savings. And if you can make the savings by achieving what you need strategically, operationally, and tactically for the military, but doing so in a collaborative way, which is cost effective for everyone, I think that is the way of the future. And I think that's recognized in the EU. And that's why you have so many of these projects now.
Right, because military equipment production are usually very secretive. You know, if you make collaboration, it's required. You have to share all this plan. And, other country may not put the money on the table without they get information. So Europe, I don't know how much level you can move on and produce collaborative military equipment. Or Russia or other country, China, they are better than Europe, or how's their capacity? They are dangerous.
I think the Russians, for instance, are definitely good in some areas, and I think they've shown that in Ukraine. They're also not so good in other areas. I mean, I think the key thing, if you take China and Russia as near peer competitors, I think the thing that the European nations and the US have in their favor is just the sheer pace of scientific innovation, which is breakneck speed in Europe, and it is in America. And I think part of that is because, Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi would ardently disagree with me on this, but my own personal feeling is part of the reason why that's the case is because in the European Union, you've got 27 democracies. And what democracy is very good at doing is enabling the free flow of ideas. Now, they can be philosophical ideas, they can be political ideas, but they can be scientific ideas, they can be innovative ideas, they can be disruptive. And it's really by that movement and dialogue and the collaborative approach. To give you an example, I was talking to a German research institute the other day who are working in the domain of radar. You have representatives from about 4 or 5 different nations on that call, all working on the same thing, all working on a product with huge military potential. And if that's not collaborative, then I don't know what is in a way.
Right.
But I think the thing is that you made the point about the issue of confidentiality and sharing information. I mean, the conduits to do that are already there, and Europe's doing it all the time. And the management and the ability to work collaboratively on things that are confidential are absolutely there. The British and the French do it with their nuclear weapons, arguably, possibly the most secret element of military affairs in Europe. But they do it, and they've been doing it for a long time, and it works very well. So it's one of those things where there's a will, there's a way. It can be done. I think it brings in in a sense, you bring into another question though, which is the ability to collaborate is also dependent on probably having a vaguely shared strategic objective or foreign policy objective too. One of the reasons why UK and US military collaboration has been so successful is because, generally speaking, both countries have had the same concerns. And I think you're seeing that in Europe now as well, that there's a sort of belief that the continent as a whole is facing the same concerns, the chief one being the role of Russia in European security. But there's other threats too. There's continuation of political violence, destabilization domestically of political institutions. So there is a sort of a willingness that, okay, we're all facing the same kind of dangers. And by accepting that willingness and moving on from it, then you're able to get that level of cooperation you need in defense research, design, development, and production.
So the other thing is supplying weapons, after, some other country, once they need urgent thing, weapon supply, is there any restriction and, condition to supply weapon? Only NATO member or not non-NATO member or non-democratic country? Can you explain?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in Europe and within NATO, I mean, every member has restrictions on where they can and can't export military equipment. And that depends on a number of things. I mean, typically it will mirror what the foreign policy of that country is regarding its strategic interests. So, I mean, a controversial topic always in Europe is about arms supplies to Saudi Arabia on the account of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's human rights record. And there's a lot of protests. Germany has seen significant protests about the supply of Eurofighter Typhoon aircraft to the kingdom. The reason that those supplies are made and the reason why European countries supply to regimes that would certainly fall well short of their own democratic and democratic character and human rights recognition is simply national interest. I mean, at the end of the day, why does the West spend so much time equipping Saudi Arabia? Because so much of the world's oil is produced by Saudi Arabia. And not only is that oil for European consumers, but that's also oil for European allies in Asia, for instance. So a willingness to protect Saudi and keep the flow of oils going not only eastwards but westwards is very, very important. Equally, the other side of that coin is there are many countries where arms are not allowed to be supplied to. I mean, Burma, also known as Myanmar, would be one of them. Obviously, there's some quite serious restrictions on China. There's absolute restrictions now on Russia for understandable reasons. So everything is kind of done on a case-by-case basis. But generally speaking, I would argue it tends to reflect whatever the national strategic interests are of the country doing the exporting at that time.
So you mentioned important thing is foreign policy also, right? And And what about, I mean, you said Burmese, yes, it can be restricted to military government, but what about democracy supporter, democracy fighter? Why not? You cannot supply them? Why? What is reason? Because their objective is clear, democracy. So far, there was no weapon supply from Western country to democracy fighter. I mean, you can restrict, you can make restriction supply on military government, but why not let them supply for democracy side?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I'm not that familiar necessarily with what's happening in Burma in terms of the opposition and arms supplies to it at the moment. I mean, a classic example would be Ukraine and arms supplies there that you're seeing being performed to a country that is, is desperately fighting for the security of its democracy. But I think the issue that you make is a good one, because I think, again, a lot of it does come down to national interest, regrettably. And it's simply a case that, does a government feel in Europe that it is in that government's interest to support whatever group it may be? And if it is, then that will happen and those exports will be made. And if it is not, then they will not. And I hate to sound cynical about it, but fundamentally, that is the calculation that is made. I think, whatever one's own personal feelings are about that, the rights or wrongs of supplying weapons to particular regimes, ultimately the question comes down to, in the corridors of power, is this considered something in our national interest? And if it is, then what you tend to find is those exports take place. Ukraine, again, is a classic example of that. If it's not in the national interest, then they won't. Or what equally you might find is that there's other levels of support that are provided instead. So a country may decide not to supply arms, but what they may do is decide to supply diplomatic support, exert pressure in other ways, apply sanctions, whatever it might be. So it's rarely one response or the other. But I think, generally speaking, it tends to be a question of domestic national interest, I think, in countries across the world, not just Europe and America, regarding which regimes they choose to support and which ones they don't.
Yes, I agree that you can do restriction. I mean, any country can do restriction. Supplying weapon, it's nothing wrong. But in case of Burma, it's it's more. I've been talking with many experts and geopolitics issue, and we found there is a important for a free country, democracy country, to gain success and to take Burma to become democracy country. So far, we found it. So the strategy is important, and the target should be necessary to help them. But nobody, start initiated Europe or America. But this time, I think they should start consideration and prepare how to support freedom and democracy in Burma. That will be definitely strategic benefit for those liberal democracy country. So I don't know, your French government and European can consider further for Burmese issue and to support at least some kind of weapon or military equipment for the defense and to gain eventually democracy in the country.
That's a decision for Mr. Macron's government, I'm afraid. I mean, I'm not familiar with familiar as I'd like to be with the situation in Burma. I think, to be fair, in France, I know domestically there is interest in it. It is reported on in the media. The situation following the coup, following the removal of the democratic government in Burma, has been widely reported on, and there is interest in it. And I think one thing to bear in mind is we don't know what's happening behind the scenes. We don't know what is happening in the covert world, and we can't speculate on what that might be. But the other thing I would say is that often these particular cases and the decision on whether to get involved in a particular conflict by supporting one side or the other are not permanent. We have a particular situation now, but who's to say that you wouldn't see some sort of foreign policy change in the future from France or from any other government for that matter, if and when the situation degenerates or it changes, however that might be. So I think we have to wait and see. But as I say, with that particular case, I'm a little less familiar, so I have to be a bit cautious about drawing too many conclusions.
Anyway, please try to support us for liberal democracy.
Well, John, listen, it's been a pleasure to talk to you today. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and let's talk again soon. And in the meantime, thank you for having me on your podcast.
Sure. Thank you, Thomas. Have a good day.
Take care.